Welcome to our channel Top Reddit Story. Make sure to subscribe our channel and leave a comment down below saying I subscribed, and we will try our hardest to reply your comment. 911 dispatchers of Reddit. What is a seemingly dumb call you got which turned out to be serious? Not a dispatcher. Was USAF security forces a long time ago. Call was a kid home alone. About a monster in the closet. Which was a bit weird. Because the kid seemed a bit old for that. Holy duck. There's a snake in the closet that's gotta be at least 150 pounds. Promptly close closet door. Nope, write the duck on out of that. Kid in hand. Called animal control. Called parent. Parent arrives first. Indicates they don't even own a snake. Let alone a people-sized snake. All parties agree monster in closet was accurate enough description of event. TLDR, monster in closet turned out to be real. Got a call where the caller was on the highway and just screaming. Couldn't figure out what was wrong because he was so amped up. Ended up being someone got hit by a semi-truck or something and the body parts were all over the highway. Yikes. One day, my buddy and I were having a beer. He'd been a firefighter for about a year then and he went into some detail about what happens when your car rolls over and you don't have a seat belt on. The doors pop open. You fly out of the car and the car rolls over you. He hated to respond to rollovers. Noise complaint. Neighbor playing music too loud and no complainant. Only reason an officer responded was because he was bored. Turns out it was a 14-year-old girl whose parents were out of town. She invited the 25-year-old man from a town 3 hours away to come over and have sex with her all night long. Cops showed up and found her. Him. Some beer and a bunch of condoms laying around. He went to jail. She went to the children's home till her parents could get back. This is more on the EMT side. And not really dumb, but all the time people call 911 and tell them someone, their parent, spouse, child etc. isn't responsive and breathing. It sucks when you get there and they are actually just having agonal respirations. Aka things just got way more serious. Agonal respirations are not sufficient breathing and are merely a reflex the body has when there's insufficient oxygen. A lot of times the family member didn't realize this was not adequate breathing and didn't start CPR. Allowing for brain damage via oxygen deprivation. Sad. Got a call from Life Alert one time, saying that one of their clients was stuck in her kitchen because her wheelchair got stuck on a cupboard. She wasn't in duress, just needed to get unstuck. Wasn't an urgent call and it was a busy night, so the road SGT had to pull a unit off the call twice due to more urgent calls. After he pulled the second unit he said he would go and help her while the other calls were being handled. When she arrived the caller's front door was open with just the screen door in place. It was a nice day for a breeze. She could see the caller from the screen door and tried to ask if there was a way to unlock the screen or if she would have to cut it to get in. The caller was not responsive to our SGT, so she called on the radio that we should have FDN route and that she was going to have to cut the screen door to make entry. When our SGT made it in, she found that the caller was sitting in her chair at the sink and was washing dishes. The caller appeared to have dropped a knife and cut into her ankle. She was unable to bend down to stop the bleeding and was on blood thinners. She did not make it. Not dispatcher, but dumb call. I work at an urgent care, and a lady called and casually said her son was struck by lightning. He seemed fine, but his primary doc wanted her to take him in for an EKG and to check out his cardiac enzymes. Told her to go to the emergency room. And she said, "Well, can't you do an EKG? Itch. Your son was struck by lightning. He needs to be monitored, as these symptoms can show up later. His heart rhythm is probably ducked." Really late to the party, but it's worth telling. My center took a call from a number like 5 times in an hour. Always radio silence on the other end. On the 6th call we finally heard enough of a voice to know someone was there and got an address and enough to know it was serious. Make entry to the house and find the caller. A man had picked up his soon-to-be ex-girlfriend to talk. He then duct taped her mouth and zip-tied her wrists and ankles and spent the next 14 hours beating her with a bat. Raping her. used a blowtorch to give her second-degree burns all over her legs and genitals, and broke her cheekbone. It was an absolutely terrifying moment, and what made it worse was on review of the tape we could hear her say help on one of the previous calls, but couldn't hear it on the initial call-in. Probably doesn't fit dumb, but this guy called and told us he killed his entire family. None of us believed this could possibly true. Turns out he wasn't kidding. He sounded totally cool and collected when he called us too. Still haunts me. A call came in and this hard to understand man says my friend is sick, he's choking from too much penis. Turns out he said peanuts, his friend had a peanut allergy. Not an officer. I was hanging out with a few of my mates. We were playing truth or dare. One of my friends would dare to stand in cement until it had hardened. By the time we realized how dumb of an idea this was, he had become part of the ground. Luckily, dispatch came over the instant we called them. But we got a lecture about not wasting their time. We did the same thing 2 days later. Not mine but my cousin. Got a call from a young woman, went like this. Cousin. 911, what's your emerg? Person. Mumbling, whispering. Cousin. What, I can't understand you, mom? Person. Mumbling, whispering. Cousin. What's the address? Person. Road. Cousin. Okay mom, what's the problem? Person. Still whispering, there's a giant man in my house. Cousin. Okay ma. Person. Screams bloody murder. So a story behind this is that the young girl was home alone and the girl's parents were at work. A man saw the house and since there was no cars there he thought no one was home and broke in through the window. And as he was breaking in she hid under her bed and called the cops. But the thing was she went under her bed where she wasn't facing the door, which means she couldn't see him walk in and her foot was sticking out and he grabbed her legs and pulled her out and stabbed her, but she survived thankfully. So yeah. So we got a call from a couple a few years back that said they had ate edibles and thought they were gonna die and all that. Obviously we thought they were just anxious from the marijuana. It turned out when we got to their apartment that the marijuana they had gotten was laced and we had to rush them to the emergency room because when we got there they were passed out. So that's my story, Reddit. My uncle was a cop and I was with him by his car and got this call. A person said her daughter was going to be arrested and wanted to know what she did wrong. They were puzzled and thought it was a prank call. A lady called saying her daughter called her because she was pulled over at the garbage dump and police were searching her because they spotted a couple of empty beer boxes in the back of the truck she was driving. The officer wasn't listening to her when she said she was taking them to the dump. The police said it is probably a story because none of their officers were on that road. My uncle was out on patrol and saw another officer. He radioed and asked if there was anyone at the dump. He said he didn't know of any of the officers being there. My uncle responded to the scene and found a girl pulled over. My uncle stopped the scene to find out it was a fake cop. Not me, but I had a friend whose dad was a cop tell me that they had someone lying naked in the road at an AskReddit race. When they got there they found that the guy had multiple guns strapped to his chest and they had to work to defuse the situation. Had a hang up 911 call just before shift change. Flow procedure and call back. Get mom on the phone who said small child was playing with phone. We sent someone from roll call out. When I got back 8 hours later it was brought back up to me because the 7-year playing with the phone was actually calling 911 because mom bit a large hole in her cheek. The opposite. I had a woman screaming and crying that her boyfriend had been shot. The whole police department and fire EMS respond to shooting calls. She was extremely rude and didn't finish EMD protocol with me. Didn't answer on call back. Turns out she verified the wrong address. And her boyfriend was hot. Not shot. She had misunderstood him. Got a call for debris in the road on the main highway heading into town. It was outside our town limits, but was passed on to us as it was pretty close. And the sheriff's department was going to take a while to get to it. We often took small calls like this as a courtesy to their depth. Once the officer arrived, he discovered the debris was what was left of a motorcyclist in a HT and run. The body was in pretty bad shape. Most likely hit by a semi. and had been subsequently run over by other motorists not realizing what it was. It gets pretty dark out in the desert, and the body looked more like someone had dropped some old clothes off the back of their truck or something. We had to track down the lady who made the original call. As it turned out, she was in the local convenience store. We discovered one of his arms had flipped up and become lodged in the grill of her car as she ran over it. Along with dealing with the original call, we had to call an ambulance as the lady panicked and went into shock when she saw the arm. Ended up being a long night. After the initial investigation phase, the whole thing was turned over to the sheriff's department. I never did hear if they caught the guy who hit him. Sometimes people call on 911 for non-threatening things and vice versa. So it doesn't surprise me when the first line is, "I don't know if this is an emergency or not." So while at work one of those comes in. "I don't know if this is an emergency, but I just saw a man shoot out the back window of a car while it was taking off." Yeah. That would qualify. Mom. Then about 4 minutes later, I get the 911 call from the girlfriend of the victim. She was driving her boyfriend to the hospital. Not me. But my cousin is a paramedic in a small town in Texas. They had received many calls from a family with a diabetic teen daughter over the years. Usually every instance was not an emergency. These calls from the parents started coming in more often and typically the symptoms were mild to moderate. Certainly not life-threatening. They always advise the parents how to manage her condition so these calls wouldn't have to happen. Late one night the parents called complaining that their daughter appeared sick. My cousin and the paramedics thought it was a typical non-emergency case and didn't rush to the scene. The station was 20 minutes away. My cousin couldn't have known the seriousness at the time. The parents just said their daughter was sick looking. When they arrived she was dead from diabetic shock. My cousin thinks she died minutes before they arrived and years later still regrets not rushing to the scene. Got a call of a one-vehicle accident. Standard. Turns out it was my 15-year-old cousin who burned to death and there was another vehicle involved with a mom. Dad and 2 daughters under the age of 10 in the vehicle. Family in the other vehicle were okay. Dad had a broken leg and mom had a cracked hip. If I remember right. Little girls were unharmed. I was the caller. 3 weeks from Christmas. Pearson Airport in Toronto. Abdi living in the woods on the edge of the property near HWY 401. Arguably the busiest highway in North America. Well, the fence was down and there was a deer on the edge of the 401, so I called to report a doe on the road. The operator said, "A doe?" I said, "Lord forgive me, but I couldn't help myself." "Yes. A doe. A deer. A female deer." She laughed. I laughed. A truck swerved so as not to hit the deer and took out 2 lanes of traffic. We stopped laughing. I'm not a dispatcher, but I work in crime intelligence. So we monitor the radio so we know what's going on. Last night there was a call about a car accident. It wasn't portrayed as a big deal. Possible small fender bender. But the dispatcher specified that there were multiple tickets out for it. Scout says they're on the way. Less than 2 minutes later, dispatcher comes back saying they're getting calls about an assault and battery at that same intersection. This very quickly turned into a fatal assault. Not sure if this counts. My mom is a 911 dispatcher. But one day she got this call about a woman who was lying in a ditch. The caller was the woman's neighbor, who didn't even bother to get out and check on her. Who said that she was staring up with a glare on her face, like she was mad about falling into the ditch or something. So my mom dispatches an officer and they find out that the woman was getting her mail and started to have a heart attack. Kinda sad that the neighbor didn't bother to get out to check on her. But whatever. People are TTY sometimes. A girl around the age of 13 called in a panic because she got her younger sister stuck in a basket inside of a closet. Every time the little sister would try and move, it would bring more pain to her. At first I thought it was a joke, but the distress in the girl's voice convinced me to send out someone to aid her. Turns out the younger sister's was wedged sideways into the basket and it was stuck at an angle in the doorway of a closet. We managed to get her out without bringing her harm. Correction officers of Reddit, have you ever met an inmate that was actually a very nice person but did absolutely horrifying crimes? If so, what's their story? I tutored in juvie. One of the boys had murdered 3 people for a gang initiation and when asked, had absolutely no remorse for it. He was a very nice, polite, and intelligent kid though who would draw me little pictures and always tried extra hard on his creative writing assignments. Had a very good sense of humor too and often made everyone in the room laugh and smile. I honestly had trouble reminding myself that he was a cold-blooded murderer. Corrections nurse here. Never interacted with this inmate. I just see him out on the yard as I come into work. He collects bread crusts and I always see him feeding the birds. And the birds trust him and fly straight to his hand to eat. He looks like a nice enough guy from a distance. And birds only land on the hands of Disney princesses. Right? Well, one day I caught him in a moment. A particularly fat pigeon landed on his hand and bent down to eat. He closed his fist on the pigeon's head and flicked his wrist to snap its neck. Its body was still flailing as he calmly put it into his pocket and then put out his hand again to feed more birds. I was told he was going to cook and eat it, which made me feel a little better. But still. And that's what comes to my mind every time an inmate is nice to me. Not a CO. RN here. I've taken care of a fair amount of detained prisoners that have been admitted to the hospital. I usually ask them what got him locked up cause I'm nosy. I had one super pleasant middle-aged guy tell me his story. Apparently he and his wife were going through or had gone through an ugly split. They were already separated when someone broke into his house with a weapon intending to hurt him. He wound up killing the guy in self-defense. I assume he had a gun or something. But not before he found out his wife had arranged it. She hired a hitman to come kill him. But instead of going to the police after, he went to his wife's place and killed her outright. Super friendly guy though. No idea how much of that was true, but that's definitely the craziest story I've heard from an inmate. Former CO here. I had 2 guys in my unit that strangled their newborns when they wouldn't stop crying. One of them was drinking and trying to watch a hockey game. His daughter wouldn't stop crying. He got annoyed, walked over and just choked her until she stopped. The other guy's story was somewhat similar, but I can't remember the details. They were both porters in that housing unit. They were doing a lot of time. Can't remember exactly how much they were given. One guy was already at year 16. Probably 2 of the nicest guys I met while on the job. They didn't come off as crazy degenerates and seemed like genuinely nice guys. I used to stand in the day room and have some interesting convos with them and their little crew they called the trailer trash circle or something to that effect. My dad worked as a doctor in a prison for a short time. Came back with lots of stories of the inmates. He said he talked to one guy who was always friendly and chill. Found out the guy had a life sentence and asked the guy why he was in prison. The guy said he had a bad lawyer. My dad looked up his information later on and it turned out he had murdered his own daughter. So yay. Never judge a book by its cover. Not a CO. But I did work in a prison. Lots of inmates were seemingly decent people. One guy in particular was a hitman. He and his story were well known at the time. When I met him, I had no idea who he was and wondered what he could have done to land in prison. When I found out who he was, I read one of the books about him. That guy was pretty brutal. My husband is a CO. The guys he talks about actually sound like good people. Then I ask what they did and it will always be a murderer or guy who spent years raping his own kids. Sounds like your husband is a personable man. Having the ability to casually interact with people who've done horrible things on a daily basis is probably one of the most important skills to have in an environment like that. Ex-CO here. Had a man who shot and killed one state trooper and shot another in the groin. He sat as a sniper in the woods and shot the troopers through the windows of the barracks. It was premeditated and he nearly got away with it. He was on FBI most wanted list for a good 2 months. The marshals caught him as he was getting ready to take off on a hang glider. Anyway, He was the most mild-mannered inmate I had met. Always reading. Never turned down his hour for rec. Always finished his plate. etc. Anyway, I was doing an escort with another officer to take him to visitation. He was to wear double-locked shackles and cuffs when not in his cell. Even in the showers. I was holding his arm and assisting him so he wouldn't trip, and I felt his bicep flex and he just stopped walking and looked at me. I realized at that moment that he could overpower me without much effort. Shackles or not. Turns out he just had to sneeze. My point is that whether someone is mild-mannered or more primitive has no effect on human capabilities. Cold-blooded Krella. For a more accurate picture, I am a 5'8", 125 pound female. Edited to add a closing sentence. Edited again to add that I'm a female. Not a CO but worked in a psych ward. In this case the guy went to prison and was eventually stepped down to our psych ward. He had stabbed his dad multiple times and killed him. He was with us for around a year, so I saw him 5-6 times a week. Anywhere from 8-14 hours each shift. He was so kind and polite. You would never think he had done anything remotely shocking. When his relationship with his dad would come up, he would talk so calmly and normally. No real hatred or anger. Yet he murdered him. If there were ever fights on the ward, he would look out for staff and other patients. I won't lie. He was a delight. TLDR, worked with the murderer. He was one of my nicest patients. Former CO here. One particular inmate fit this bill for me. I worked third shift on a housing unit and as such had to oversee the floor cleaning crew, comprised of 7 or 8 inmates, one of whom was their supervisor. The supervisor was a guy I just didn't understand. He was about 50. Extremely polite. Worked his ass off. Never got into trouble or broke the rules. Always kept his guys on task. I didn't get it. I knew he had been in since he was 18 but never bothered to look up his crime until I was about to leave the job. Sure enough. It was bad. At 18 he had abducted, raped, and kept a 13-year-old girl in his parents' basement for about a week. I think it was his parents who turned him in. Former CO. Absolutely all the time. I usually found myself having pleasant conversations with inmates almost like they are old buddies, only to find out they are in for horrendous crimes. Had one guy who was super kind. Trying to give me advice. I was a 19-year-old fresh-faced CO about how to manage inmates with my inferior age and size. Super kind and respectful. I looked him up on our system to see what he was in for. Expecting something small. To find he was in for murder and arson in the first degree. Honestly, the both comforting and terrifying thing is majority of inmates are just like everyone else who just have made bad. Some really bad choices. TV greatly over-exaggerates criminals to be sociopaths. Set in their ways. And inhumane. It puts into perspective how easily you could be on the other side of the bars. Not a CO. But every person that came in contact with Edmund Kemper said he was well spoken and seemed like a gentle giant. Until he started talking about his crimes. I think that's what makes him the most fearsome serial, in my opinion. Because with the way he talks and seems kind at first, I probably would have been a young dumb kid that would have gotten in his car too. From my personal experience, the nicest inmates are usually the ones who have committed the worst crimes. Murder, act. The ones that always give you problems are the guys that get arrested for minor shit like petty theft, cannabis, loitering. They always come in with major attitudes that never ends well. Obligatory, not a corrections officer. But I am an intake mental health therapist. And we see a large number of people who are put on probation. Respecting confidentiality and all. There was one guy I remember who was in his early 50s. Had done some objectively horrible things. And it all stemmed from trauma reactions. He grew up severely abused and neglected. And he wanted so much to just be able to be left alone to live life. As he knew he couldn't function in society. It was heartbreaking. Former inmate here. Long story short, I was sentenced to state prison for selling small amounts of marijuana. And during my time in the high security classification facility I enrolled in a Jewish study group to meet people and pass the time. One of the other regular members happened to be a former professor of economics from UPenn, specializing in game theory, who happened to be a really nice and personable guy if you could just look past the fact he was therefore beating his wife to death with a crowbar over a divorce settlement. Needless to say we made a lot of prisoner's dilemma jokes. I've spent a year with a prisoner. I was fellow inmate. The sickest most wild guy would talk all the time and he was friendly and nice but would turn on you in seconds if you said something wrong. Super short fuse. Screaming off the handle. You always had a sense of no soul in his eyes. Current CO here. Back when I worked with juveniles, I had one kid that was very quiet, relatively well behaved, and friendly enough that it almost made you forget that he'd beaten his sister down, duct taped her to the bed, and brutally raped her. Or the similar kid that was involved in the shooting death of a 9-month-old baby. Working with juveniles sucks. Former caseworker, state prison, CO, and jailer. Frequently the people you meet interact in a normal manner. If I didn't know what their past was you wouldn't be able to guess. 3 are most assuredly exceptions to this. I've had inmates on my caseload that most definitely did not deserve prison. I've also had a few that I have no issue believing they have no soul. I am not a CO, but I work in addictions recovery. You realize that everyone is fundamentally the same when you get wrecked in a game of Magic the Gathering by a Latino gangbanger with teardrop tattoos. That guy could sling spells like nobody's booziness. He was also really good at killing people apparently. Supervisor here. I run chow each morning and a while back there was a guy who would come through the line each morning smiling and being quite friendly and personable saying good morning lieutenant. He was friendly enough that I had never bothered to look him up as far as his crime details. Much later I go to his unit to visit the officer and notice a strange open letter on the officer's desk. I ask about it and the officer tells me oh yeah, that's from Jones. He's been trying to get back to his Caribbean country for years. Turns out the guy has dual citizenship and wants to get transferred there. He can't though because his crime was committed in our state. He had gotten in a big argument with his wife outside his house one winter night and beat her to death and then cut off her head. He then took the head and left the body on the doorstep. Even more messed up was that he left their 2-year-old with the body. Police later received a call about a crying child and found the kid holding on to his dead mother in the snow. The kid was cold but unharmed. The inmate still comes through the line just as friendly as can be. I wish him good morning in return but keep a bit closer eye on him now that I know his background. Not a CO, but a cop. Arrested a dude one time for raping his granddaughter an uncountable number of times and videotaping it, producing child pornography, and possessing hundreds of GB of child porn. He would show his granddaughter the porn and tell her that's what granddaughters do for grandfathers. She was 6. He was a normal, nice dude with us. Cooperative and had a pretty good family life. Doesn't change the fact that he was an evil duck who is going to die in prison. I still think about that case a lot. I wonder how the girl is doing. I've often thought about checking in with the family, but I didn't want to rekindle any past memories. Hope they are well. I know he'll never taste freedom again. Both of my parents work at a psychiatric hospital for people who are found mentally incompetent to stand trial, or that are awaiting assessment for it. My mom never wants to know what people did, because she doesn't want it to color her opinion of them. Sometimes surreal things happen. Like a guy standing in the yard looking really hard at something just outside the fence. She asked him what he was doing and he said, "Look at that weird bird. Do you see that tall bird over there? It keeps looking at me." She just told him she couldn't see it but her eyesight was bad. And it was outside the fence so he was safe. He accepted that answer and wandered off. There are so many that are locked up because they have mental issues. Get arrested for walking down the street naked or something. Get institutionalized. Get medicine. Get better. Get released. Quit taking medicine. Repeat. But there are some that did really horrific things. and that will never see freedom again. Some guy murdered his mother and cut out her heart and pissed in the cavity. That's the one that really sticks out. Very nice docile dude. Gotta wonder if he just lost his mind. Or if she did something awful to him. Obligatory, not a correction officer. But I had a similar job. One of the nicest, most polite, likable inmates that I worked with was serving time for assaulting an off-duty police officer. The officer was in the hospital for months and had serious brain damage to where he will never recover and live his normal life again. If I didn't know the backstory and just met this inmate on the street, I would have thought he'd be someone I'd be friends with. He was kind, calm, and funny and liked by all the staff and never would have been pegged as someone who would commit such a crime. However, shockingly enough, he was never sorry about his actions or said he regretted what happened or anything. Maybe his likable personality was just a ruse. But it worked. I interned at a mental health ward for kids. On my first day, I just played cards and basketball with all the kids to get to know them. One girl stuck out to me. She was a little kooky, but had a great sense of humor and was amazing at I described her as a budding card shark to my internship group. On my second day, I read the kids' files. Miss Card Shark was in there for killing her family's dog. I was so shaken. I considered asking to switch to a different internship, but ended up staying. MCS had actually been there for 2 years and was in the final stages of successful treatment. So for the rest of my time with her, she was just like any other kid. It was definitely weird, though, when she was playing games with other kids and would jokingly say "I'll heal you." I am a CO. Twice a week I go and get an inmate to clean up offices in the facility. He has access to lots of things he could heal me with. Has healed people and as a former shot caller, has had lots of people beat down, stabbed, and some healed. I love to read. And this guy has read pretty much every book written. As he's been in seg so much that he just read all day. All the time. Since I don't share any personal details with inmates. Whether they just stole a truck or held kids or talked in theaters. Real heinous shit. You know. And keep my life on lockdown. Books are a safe topic. He is very smart. And has a grasp of literature and its impact that is refreshing and enjoyable. I love talking with Garnell, made up name, about books while he cleans and I make sure he doesn't get into off-limits areas or heal anyone. I work in juvenile corrections. There are a lot of pretty nice kids that have done some pretty ducked up shit. One in particular is a little 12-year-old that gets constantly picked on by the other inmates because he is short and he has bowel problems so he has to wear diapers. Turns putty abused multiple little kids. Would trap rats to break their spines. And had a habit of throwing cats off of tall buildings to see if they land on their feet. Not me. But my dad was a CO and had someone in his building that was a respected member of a Jewish community somewhere. His daughter's boyfriend raped her and left her for dead on the side of the road. The inmate found and rescued his daughter. Then went and killed the boyfriend with a shotgun. Outside of this one act that got him life in prison. The inmate was a very intelligent and nice guy. Only heard about him once. Dad didn't like to talk about work at home. Not me, but my sibling is a sheriff in a Canadian province. Sheriffs in Canada handle courtroom security and transportation of prisoners. She had one person in custody who was on trial after getting caught for murdering multiple women. He was in his early 20s and her exact words were, "Thank goodness he got caught because if I didn't know better I definitely would have been friends with the guy."